Well, howdy there, Internet people. It's Bo again. So, today we're going to do an in-depth exploration of a topic. We're going to talk about something, and we're going to look at the history of it. And we're going to discuss it, because there's a lot of confusion about the Second Amendment. On both sides of this debate. So, we're going to find out, what does it mean? In order to do that, we're going to have to know where it came from. Along the way, we're going to find out who it applies to, what it protects, and then we can talk about whether or not we should keep it. So, what is the Second Amendment? A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. One sentence. And because it's a little murky, there's been debate over it for years. If only there was some document we could look back to find out what it really meant. If only there was a historical record that could clear this up for us. There is. There is. Because while Thomas Jefferson gets a lot of credit for writing a lot of things, the reality is there's a guy named George Mason who kind of got swept from history a little bit. There are a lot of references to him still, but he's not somebody we hold up as a founding father very often. And we'll find out why along the way. But Mason, what he did was he wrote a lot of stuff, then kind of handed it to Jefferson. And was like, hey, here's my homework, change it up a little bit so the teacher doesn't notice. So, one more time, the Second Amendment is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay. Stop me when this sounds familiar. A well-regulated militia, composed of the body of the people, trained to arms, is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. That standing armies in time of peace should be avoided as dangerous to liberty, and that in all cases the military should be under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. That is Section 13 of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, written before the Second Amendment. It's written by George Mason. So what's different? Well, the most obvious part is they took out that part about standing armies being dangerous. Now, why did they do that? Article 1, Section 8, Clause 12 of the U.S. Constitution grants the government the power to have a standing army. It wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to have something in the Bill of Rights saying that was dangerous. So it got left out. Even though they still believed it was dangerous. This is evidenced by the fact that although they allowed a standing army, well, they could only fund it for 2 years at a time. Same clause. The other part is what has become so murky. Composed of the body of the people got changed to the people. And that became confusing because it mentions a militia as well. This bothered Mason a lot. One of the reasons that we don't hear about him as much is because he didn't sign the Constitution. In fact, he went back home to his home state and argued against ratifying it. Part of the reason was the ambiguity of some of the things in it. He also felt it gave the feds too much power. I can understand him being angry about his work being a little bit more clouded, because the other people he gave his homework to, well, they made it more clear, not less. Let me know if this sounds familiar. Rather than Section 13, it is Article 13 of Pennsylvania's. That the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state, and as standing armies in the time of peace are dangerous to liberty, they ought not to be kept up, and that the military should be kept under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. They didn't even change that last part. But they did change the beginning. they added that protect themselves. So it's definitely an individual right. It was certainly intended to be that. Historically, there's not a lot of evidence of any kind whatsoever to suggest otherwise. It is definitely an individual right. Now, you don't actually have to take my word for it, because George Mason himself, when he was arguing against adopting something, he answered the question, who is the militia? And this is really cool because you're also going to get a dose of class consciousness from the 1700s. I ask, who are the militia? They consist now of the whole people, except a few public officers. But I cannot say who will be the militia of the future day if that paper on the table gets no alteration. The militia of the future day may not consist of all classes, high and low, and rich and poor, but they may be confined to the lower and middle classes of people, granting exclusion to the higher classes of people. With bone spurs. Okay, I made that last part up. But it was very clear. The guy who wrote it, it's the whole people. It's an individual right, extending low to high, everybody. Now at the time, this just meant guys that looked like me who own land. But as our country has evolved, it has begun, it now applies to everybody. Because now everybody is supposed to have full rights in this country. So now we know who it applies to. Now the next question is, what does it protect? And in order to understand that, we have to address that lingering question. If they decided to have standing armies, why on earth do we need the Second Amendment? Why would we need a militia if we're going to have a standing army? That doesn't make sense. We're going to have the militia to fight the standing army if need be. That's really why it was there. The idea was that the locals would be able to defeat the federal troops or foreign troops or whoever it may be because they know the terrain. So it was left in there. The Second Amendment was designed to give parity of arms between the average person and a soldier. Parity of arms. What that means is that the Second Amendment was specifically designed to protect weapons of war. I know we hear that a lot today. We don't want weapons of war on our streets. And maybe we don't. But that's what the Second Amendment was designed to protect. And you don't have to take my word for that. In the 1930s, two guys bought some shotguns. Their barrels were too short. And the federal government had made a regulation saying you couldn't have short-barreled shotguns, barrels with less than 18 inches. They claimed it was their Second Amendment right. In U.S. versus Miller, 1939, this is what the Supreme Court had to say about it. In the absence of any evidence tending to show that possession or use of a shotgun having a barrel less than 18 inches in length at this time has some reasonable relationship to the preservation or efficiency of a well-regulated militia, we cannot say that the Second Amendment guarantees the right to keep and bear such an instrument. Short version, since that shotgun is not a combat shotgun, it is not useful in combat, it's not protected. The Second Amendment is there to protect weapons of war. Now, one of the funny questions you always get asked, the rhetorical question is, well, does that mean that you should be able to buy a tank? In a strict reading of it, yeah, that is what it means. However, I like to think most people are sane, and that might be a little bit of overkill. And I believe that it's important to note that any group of people facing off against a modern military would use asymmetrical tactics. They wouldn't need a tank. They would need semi-automatic rifles, though. So that's where we're at. And then the follow-up to that is always, well, there's no way the Founding Fathers could have predicted semi-automatic rifles. They couldn't have predicted the weapons of war that we have today. Now, the standby answer to that from the gun community is, well, they couldn't have predicted the internet. Does that mean you don't have free speech on the internet? I don't think that's a good argument. I think there's a better one out there. And the better one is, oh, they totally could have predicted it because there were weapons that were rapid fire at the time. Check out the Puckle gun, P-U-C-K-L-E, the Belton flintlock, the pepper box revolver, and then there's also an air rifle that I can't remember the name of. It's Italian. There were what people today would consider semi-automatic weapons at the time. In fact, George Washington commissioned 100 Belton flintlocks for his army. They never got delivered because Belton wanted way too much money. So, that brings us to the last question. Why keep it? Why do we need this? The Founding Fathers made a lot of mistakes, but they were smart about a lot of things. This is one of them. We keep it for the same reason they wrote it in there 200 years ago, as a hedge against tyranny. Because it doesn't matter how many mass shooters you're talking about, which year, which decade you want to add up, it doesn't come close to the number of people killed by government, by democide. Guns don't kill people. Governments do. Anyway, it's just a thought. Y'all have a good night.